a very great privilege to have the opportunity to be here this afternoon. And first of all, I would like to thank wholeheartedly all the organizers for organizing this event, and especially providing us the opportunity to discuss what has become an increasingly topical issue. We didn't think it would be so topical 3 months ago. Not least because it's bringing to the forefront in many ways the question of a contrast between the very spectacular re-engagement or engagement of a number of international players. And of course we all start with China, but we keep going and the list keeps being increasingly impressive. You just have to look at the number of countries that have organized with the Africans summits, like Turkey, like Korea, like the Indians who are about to hold their second Africa Forum, etc. And Europe seems, of course, we have a strategic partnership. But beside that, Europe seems to have kept a vision of Africa, which I will argue today is largely outdated. So what I'd like to do today is, first of all, try to present what I think has been a European model, a very original one, which we tend to forget, especially these days when we are confronted with waves of doom and gloom about the future of Europe. Europe's development model, I would like to argue, is in terms of impact fairly similar to models such as the Flying Geese model or the Washington Consensus model, if it ever was successful. I would call this model the Lure of Membership model. The Lure of Membership model is really initially a model that was about the reconstruction of Europe in the 50s. It involved processes of structural adjustment under the Marshall Plan, the OECD, and later the conclusion of the Rome Treaty. And it combined, in many ways, three segments, three pillars, which I think are still central to the identity of Europe, but also to the way it's been built. Opening up of economies, democratization, which was already established, but which has always been a precondition to membership of the European Union. Then regional integration, and in all sorts of ways. And of course, once one wants to become a new member of the EU, the pre-accession agreements require that you have to endorse the acquis communautaire. But that dimension is pretty original. And in fact, this is what in many ways makes the difference with the so-called Washington model. So we could talk about the Brussels model. But the last aspect is equally significant and important. It's the issue of legitimacy. The lure of membership. As we all know, once we are members of the EU, we take it for granted and then we start parroting. But what is extraordinary in many ways, and I take here the case of the last rounds of negotiations, the last waves of negotiation, that led to the transformation of the EU into an entity of 27 states, and the amount of political will and acceptance of deep processes of structural adjustment that went along with what, in the end, resulted in membership of the European Union. So these pillars, which have been, of course, codified in the early 1990s under the name of the Copenhagen criteria, although they were not quite expressed that way. The legitimacy issue was not so explicitly mentioned, but it's obviously the key issue. The sense of ownership to the processes, and the sense of ownership which, even when the processes are quite hard-taking, are ultimately legitimized by the fact that once you are a member of the European Union, you belong, and you are entitled to participate in decision-making processes. This is an extraordinary model. It is really a model of treatment of North-South disparities that we tend to forget about. It's been extremely successful, and we should compare it with the problems which we are now facing, and discuss it in the context of the problems that we are now facing in relation with our southern territories. Because after all, that model was very successful in treating the relationship with eastern territories in the aftermath of the Cold War. The interesting side about this model is we've tried to export it. We may not have been always conscious about the fact that we were doing it, but we tried to do that. And this is where the translation started getting problematic, and I would say today awfully wrong. Initially, of course, the way we exported it was in a sort of organic way, through the incorporation into the Rome Treaty, that's Title 4, of the association of the Francophone, the French, because they were still French colonies, the Belgian, the Italian colonies. Association was granted, not negotiated. It was part of the vision of Africa as an appendix of Europe, an extension of Europe. There was no law of membership there. There were not, negotiations only started with the renewal and following independence of the countries concerned, that is after 62 and the Yaoundé Conventions. These were the days of imperial preferences systems. They were the years of transition from imperial rule towards hegemony. And they were the years during which a number of the features that still exist today were crafted. Of course, the EDF, the European Development Fund, dates back to these years. But also, interestingly, the asymmetrical preference system that became so the hallmark of Lomé was initially associated with the association status, the AM status, and then phased out in the late 60s. I'll come back to this because it's an interesting twist to see that it was reinstated. Lomé Convention was really an attempt to have an aggiornamento, a model for North-South dialogue and the expression of a re-evaluation of EU Sub-Saharan Africa relations. Because we should never forget, negotiations toward Lomé started during the week after the Yom Kippur War. Europeans really felt they were in a difficult position, and they were very concerned to have access to the raw materials of Africa. There are very famous quotes by Chesson, the commissioner who then negotiated what became known as the Lomé Convention, that Europeans, because of their dependency on energy and strategic minerals, strategic for a different reason than today, but strategic, that Europe had to accept a quid pro quo. And of course, there was the idea that this would be the base of the new international economic order. So the contents of the convention are interesting to refer to, because we have the four pillars of our European model already present there. We have, first of all, the liberalization and regulation aspect through the reintroduction, and this is because of the strategic context. The Europeans didn't want it initially. It's the pressure of the ACPs that imposed on Europe the reinstatement of a non-reciprocal trade system that conferred totally free access to the European markets on all ACP exports of manufactured products and on 95% of agricultural products. The ACPs were, as a result of that, placed, as Chris Stevens put it once, at the apex of the pyramid of trade preferences. Other policy instruments were established, such as STABEX and later SISMIN, and they were, of course, I know technically they were not working the same way, but they were in the spirit of something that existed in the early 60s, the surprix system, the higher than world prices system. Then there was a sense of ownership that one tried to develop. That's the legitimacy component. Through the introduction of co-management procedures and through the establishment of the group-to-group institution that still exists today. The democracy component was largely overlooked. These were the days of the Cold War, and one preferred cultivating patronage and clientelism to insisting on democracy. Of course, Lomé has been known as a model that turned into a symbol of unfulfilled expectations. Yet, with respect, I would say that one of the areas where Lomé was pretty successful is regional integration. And not for the reason that I would normally develop when discussing this issue. Regional integration in Africa, as far as economics are concerned, has had difficulties to go forward. No, the knock-on effects of Britain's membership of the European Union in 1972 and the conclusion of the Lomé Convention, which involved all the independent sub-Saharan African states, plus Caribbean and Pacific ones, meant that there was a global framework created that suddenly enabled the logics of colonial blocs to be overcome. ECOWAS would have never been established if there had not been 2 months earlier the conclusion of the Lomé Convention. And there are several reasons for this. One of them is because the head of Nigeria at the time, General Gowon, was a very smart person. General Gowon was very concerned at establishing ECOWAS because he was concerned at establishing a new regional order. These regional organizations were not about economics, they were about building regional orders. And Gowon, because he had faced the problems of Nigeria's isolation amidst Francophone countries during the Civil War, basically wanted to create the ECOWAS. Initially he wanted to create it first and then have negotiations with the European Union. But this was definitely proving to be a problem. And in the end, because he was a pragmatist, and because Nigeria was empowered by its oil resources and its decision not to apply the OPEC embargo, in the end, Gowon took the lead of the ACP group, negotiated with in a position of strength with the European Union, and this is why, in the end, trust was established and ECOWAS was created. The charter was signed, the Lagos Charter was signed in May 1975. I've developed this example because I think it's quite telling, and it helps also to go beyond some conventional views about North-South relations being an obstacle to the development of South-South interactions. I could also have mentioned the case of SADC, SADCC, and the considerable support that was given by the European donors to its establishment as an alternative to the South African project of CONSAS in the early 80s. So, Cotonou may have turned into a model that didn't fulfill expectations, but certainly it was not totally lost in translation. What about Cotonou? Cotonou was negotiated, I think this is the first point that should be stressed, in a context where perhaps visions of Africa, representations of Africa, could not have been more degraded. European representations of Africa were fast changing. Africa appeared to be the dispensable continent in the 1990s. Fall of communism in Europe was changing Europe's priorities. Enlargement in the Balkans were the concern. The conclusion of the GATT-Uruguay round of negotiations also had the effects of casting the problem of WTO compatibility into a different mold. Yet, the CPA, the Cotonou Partnership Agreement's ambition was to provide a roadmap towards quite a new and original inter-hemispheric partnership, which would involve subscription to common norms, that is, heading towards democratization and human rights enforcement, the creation of a FTA area, free trade area, the conclusion of economic partnership agreements, which initially were meant to be called regional economic partnership agreements, between the EU and 6 regional groupings formed by the ACP states, 5 of which in sub-Saharan Africa. And then there was the question of legitimacy, which was thought to be addressed through the continuation of group-to-group relationships. 10 years later, the overall pattern is a pattern in disarray. The subscription of two common political norms, which was very much a transcription into into the agreements, of the experience of the European agreements, but with an enormous difference. The enormous difference stemmed from the fact that in Europe, the revolutions have taken place. Just as in South Africa, where the inclusion of the Human Rights and Democracy Clause in 1994 was not seen as a conditionality, but as an opportunity and a protection in the case of seeing the apartheid system, there would be attempts to reinstate the apartheid system. Well, in most of the SCPs, at best, the issue of introducing human rights as a conditionality element was something that had to be negotiated. And in fact, the problem was that, unlike what would have happened in Europe, where it would have been impossible for a non-democratic country to become a member of the European Union, the ACPs were already members of the Lomé Agreement, and therefore they became members, although they didn't have to stick to the conditionalities. And of course, as we know, the conditionalities are only interesting in the sense that they give to political scientists like myself the opportunity to study how they are implemented and where and when they are not. The second aspect to Cotonou was the blend between trade liberalization and regional integration, the EPA negotiations, which were meant to provide the backbone of the Cotonou Agreement. 8 years after the negotiations, And I'm quoting here a report of November 2010 from the ECDPM by Sanusi Bilal and Isabel Ramdou. I think the conclusion of the report is really extremely convincing, in the sense that they state that after 8 years of negotiation, which are running 3 years behind schedule, the EPA agenda remains divisive and inconclusive. And this is a way, they're speaking softly on this one. The EPA has lost momentum, and if the existing tensions are not resolved in the process itself may have lasting negative consequences on the overall economic and political relationship between the ACPs, Africa, and the European Union. By November last year, only 36 of the 77 ACP members had concluded some type of agreement. In fact, many ACP states had gone for EBAs, everything but arms arrangements, offers, because that was a good way of shunting the system. So definitely a more strategic vision towards ACP Africa and EU relations is desperately required, conclude the same authors in November 2010. But is the JACE, the Joint EU-Africa Strategic Partnership, providing this strategic vision? I'll come to that in a minute. But certainly such comments and the widespread criticism voiced since December 2007 summit in Lisbon fall into a model lost in translation, and not least because of the way trade liberalization has been imposed, or at least is being imposed, through extremely restrictive interpretations of WTO compatibility. And I think we Europeans, given the way we've managed, and I'm not deciding that, I think it was motivated by extremely laudable policies, the way we've managed a number of policy orientations, including the agriculture, where we became so successful that we didn't know in the end what to know with our butter and our production. But certainly, our experience, the value of the experience of Europe is really about the value of being flexible on these issues. And therefore, we are not talking about a model that's lost in translation, we are talking about a model that's not even being implemented during the negotiations. The paradox about the way Lomé has evolved, the way Cotonou has evolved, however, is that it's not really, as far as the regional integration component, it's not really the EU that has been pushing as a sort of proactive agenda region building in Africa. It's the fear of the EU that has been having an effect. In many ways, when reading the current state of the interim and the EPA agreements, what is striking is to see how EU pressures turn to be an incentive for so many of the regional economic communities in Africa, like COMESA, the East African Community, or CEMAC in Central Africa, to accelerate negotiations toward the harmonization of tariffs in view of the implementation of common external tariffs. Well, after all, if this is one of the effects, it should be considered to be positive. Another aspect which I think was directly linked to the EU negotiation strategy, and which is quite positive, is that the long-awaited process of rationalization of multiple membership among African organizations has been in many ways resolved thanks to the EU and to its insistence that an individual state can only be a member of a single trading arrangement with the EU. So the result was basically that you couldn't be in several negotiation groupings, and that at long last African countries started thinking about rationalizing their multiple participation, something which also goes back to the point I was making about regional organization in Africa being more about regional order than about economic integration so far. And of course, patronage, international patronage, being a key issue, and that's why it's a good thing to be a member of several organizations at the same time, because you may capture more resources by doing it. But when you want to be serious, and when you have to be serious because there's pressure from the EU, among others, about trade agendas, then you can't be a member of several regional organizations. So I know that there was a lot of criticism against the EU, accused by some NGOs that it was introducing a new Berlin in Africa, which shows that people didn't know really what Berlin is about. Berlin set the rules, didn't set the borders. But certainly I think the fact that the EU simply asked that one country should belong to a single group at a time was a very good point. And in fact, the ECA had been trying to rationalize relations between regional organizations for years without being successfully able to do so. Well, thanks to the process of Cotonou, at least, an achievement is taking place. This process has moved on. So the Cotonou landscape today is primarily characterized, I would say, by pressure for trade liberalization within an overall context characterized by the streamlining of EU-ACP relations and stalled EPAs due to the capacity of ACPs to fend off European sanctions. Because that's certainly something that was not anticipated initially. The international context has changed. And the African states, the ECPAs, ECP countries, have a capacity to fend off. They are no longer in the weak position which they were in at the time when the barrel of oil was around $10. So why are we in such a situation? Why, and I will go back to one of the points I have mentioned earlier on, why is the EU not taking Africa more seriously? I would like to turn to what I would call European perceptions and interactions with Africa. And I see two dominant patterns that are rooted in history. The first one is the vision of Africa as an area of fundamental instability, what I call Africa as the dark continent. And of course, I'm referring here to the stereotypes of colonial representations of Africa as the heart of darkness, Joseph Conrad. The origins of humanity that goes celebrated with the Art Premier, but also with a vision of Africa as being where humanity is expressed in its most primitive pulses. And this vision is not too far from us, because after all, in the 1990s, the article that probably had the greatest influence on shaping visions of Africa, that was widely read in the chancelleries, and you just need to see how many references to this article there are in the memoirs of the Clinton administration. I know in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs it was read by everyone. That's the article by Robert Kaplan, published under the title The Coming Anarchy, How Scarcity, Crime, Overpopulation and Disease are Rapidly Destroying the Social Fabric of our Planet. That was published in the Atlantic Monthly, and that was basically published as a way of describing through the prism of Africa, and more specifically the prism of Liberia, what the world was heading for. And of course, Kaplan's apocalyptic scenario rejuvenated old images of the dark continent by stressing the so-called senselessness and irrational spread of violence and criminality in Africa. Different interpretations took place. Some insisted on the criminalization of African politics. Others insisted on the African state being an empty shell, a quasi-state. And that's, of course, an earlier phrase used by Jackson and Rosberg. And the global prototype of the anti-developmental state. That is really how Africa has been perceived in the literature and in the writings of Peter Evans or in Atul Kohli's writing. The African state has become the epitome of the neo-patrimonial, totally anti-developmental state. And we're still living with that. We're still living with the idea that after all we can intervene in Libya because this is a quasi-state, just as the Americans thought they could intervene on the eve of a presidential campaign in Somalia because it was a quasi-state. Quasi-states are just there because internationally they have legal recognition, but they don't have a capacity. Well, they do have a capacity to make you lose elections, and that's the lesson of the situation in Somalia. The second strand I'd like to stress, and I think is still very much present with us, is Africa as an opportunity to reconcile ethics and foreign policy. And that's, of course, the famous quote of Tony Blair, when he depicted Africa as a scar on the conscience of the world in the early 2000s. And that's very much what happened in 2005, the year of Africa, the year during which we had all the concerts organized throughout Europe, the mobilization, the G8 summits, where Africa became considered as a symbol of the pitfalls of globalization. This compassionate approach, which went along with the idea that one should not have restrictions about intervening in Africa, that even if necessary we should not hesitate to re-establish situations of quasi-trusteeship. The flip side of such a vision was that in the US as in Europe, emphasis on humanitarianism went along with minimal significance attached to the geostrategic and economic stakes in Africa. Africa was described by a French geographer as a dark corner in the world, on the map of the world, sorry. Other people talked about the risk of seeing Africa fall off the map of the world when Iraq was mobilizing everybody's attention. There is a think tank in the US that in the early 2000s basically stated that the only importance of Africa related to the fact that you needed to refuel on your way to the Middle East, and Africa was good for that. So, it is only in December 2000 that a report that was produced in the US by the Council on Foreign Relations challenged this vision. And this was very unusual at the time, and the title of the report is very telling. The title is More Than Humanitarianism. Basically, the report was saying there is more to Africa than just good humanitarian feelings. Africa is not a continent where you can express humanitarian feelings because there are no strategic stakes. Africa is not just a continent where you can, in the middle of the Iraq war, organize the Bunia-Artemis operation, because Africa is now where the Europeans can get together and agree, because there are so few states. So how has this turned into policies? First of all, the JACE, the Joint EU-Africa Strategic Partnership. Of course, the JACE was very much associated with the personality, the strong personality that I would compare with that of an early Commissioner Claude Chesson of Louis Michel. And his statements, his powerful statements in 2000, when he was saying, along with his friend, the chairman of the African Union, Alpha Conari, another key personality, so forceful, so much personality that after him we decided to have no longer a former head of state. This can become a bit uncontrollable. So Louis Michel was talking about the need to craft a new and strategic partnership based on equal relations, the need to depart from moralistic and paternalistic visions of the continent, the need to depart from the legacy of the Berlin Conference. And of course, the second Africa-Europe Summit was, in that sense, a critical moment. It was expected to start a critical momentum. It was a critical moment because it took place a year after the Chinese had very successfully organized their FOCAC conference, managed to get all the African states except those 5 who didn't recognize China as a single state to be invited. The Chinese had launched a very ambitious action plan, and they were implementing it, which is something unusual as far as these sort of plans. And a whole range of other initiatives were taking place, while we Europeans had decided since 2003 that we couldn't organize the summit because we didn't want Mugabe to be there. But we have no problem about other African dictators. It's just that Mugabe we didn't want. So in the end, we held the summit. Mugabe came. Gordon Brown didn't attend. And we all expected that the implementation of the strategic partnership, a very ambitious project that was announced, would mean a new departure. We are going to have in the panel Andrew Sheriff, who has written extensively on these issues as part of his agenda at ECDPM. So I think I would leave it to him to be much more precise on the current state of the JACE. What I would simply like to say, and I'm being provocative because that's why I was invited, I think the JACE has become an extremely ambitious exercise in soft power, in attempting to diffuse the European soft power diplomacy. And so far I think it's not been very successful. The criticism has kept rising. The problem with the agenda of the JACE is that there is no capacity for legal enforcement, so we are back to Cotonou. The problem is also lack of funding, but after all, I would think that funding is not such a problem when you deal with ACPs. The problem is how to spend more often. And in many respects, the incapacity of the JACE to clearly identify what Europe's priorities are and set the basis upon which they will be discussed. In other words, the JACE could be a fantastic instrument, but we first need to know what we want to do with Africans and in Africa. And I think in many ways I've learned more about what the priorities and interests of Europe in Africa are by reading the reactions of our various foreign ministers and reactions in the press following the uprising in North Africa. That's only then that we started learning about what our real interests were. Until then, of course, we heard about the importance of partnership. The importance of partnership only makes sense when you're discussing with people who have legitimacy. When you're discussing with people whose legitimacy is fraught with problems, when you organize the African Summit in Tripoli, it's not surprising that after that nobody hears about what happened in Tripoli in the press, both in Europe and in Africa. So there has been clearly a fatigue about the J's because the problems are not being addressed and the problems are the way the CPA should have been implemented, could have been implemented, and certainly could have constituted an interesting and stimulating model. Europe's de facto policies and interests, I would argue, and I've published this elsewhere, so I'll be short on this. I would argue Europe's de facto policies and interests are really associated with the treatment of Africa as an increasing distance abroad. That's sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa we tend to treat as a limus. Of course, there's a process of constructive disengagement taking place. Very spectacular. And this translates into the provision of decisive support to long-term capacity building in the context of the AU African peace security architecture. The Africa First mantra coincides, of course, with the United States and European members' reluctance to commit troops to the UN peacekeeping operations. It also coincides with attempts to craft a new international division of labor in the field of peacekeeping. And I must say, in this respect, the AU's Constitutive Act is creates an extremely enabling environment, since it is probably the boldest. It includes the boldest articles with respect to the capacity of member states to interfere into each other's affairs in the case of Palestine. There is no equivalent to such disposition in any other similar agreement. So, in theory, it's all very nice. Of course, European troops have kept intervening in Africa. We know this very well today. But whenever they've been sent under the ESDP, this has tended to be for short-term mandates. And I would very much agree here with Alex Vine's comment that it often seems we are trying to experiment how we can do and build increased European coordination of policies within member states. In other words, the agenda is not about Africa, it's about us. So this is why, despite this process, despite the fact that it involves considerable resources channeled towards the AU and towards these operations, into a process of constructive disengagement. Similarly, in parallel, North Africa is being treated as a limit and a buffer. Status quo enforcement has become the key phrase, although it was never expressed that way, to understand what was going on in Europe's relations with the North African states, including in the context of the European Neighbourhood Policy, the negotiation of mobility packages designed to provide better access to the EU for those countries willing to cooperate on readmission, irregular migrations and border management. The priority assigned by the EU to border security, to the securitization of borders, including as a result of post-9/11 concern, and to trade liberalization, has also prompted the EU and its member states to disregard violations of democratic and human rights by authoritarian regimes in the Maghreb. So, I would like now to conclude with 4 remarks, which are meant to stimulate discussion, hopefully, and which will try to draw from the recent events in Africa. On democratization and human rights, I would first say that European reactions to the uprising in North Africa were, to me, extremely revealing. They were very often stunned reactions, a difficulty to grasp what was going on and to accept the full implications, or at least a rejection of the implications of a democratization process that was a bottom-up process, In other words, that is in accordance with our European model, and not in accordance with the model we try to project on North African states and African countries in general. I would also say that rather than focusing on an elusive treat Africa as one, which is one of the mantras meant to show that we care more for Africa, there's an urgent need for a speak about Africa as one. The uprisings have been a powerful reminder that it's not because the EU doesn't have an Africa policy that it doesn't have interest in Africa, and we should clarify that. The last point on this issue, I would say, is that the EU is too close to North Africa to simply treat it as a limit. In other words, there is more to North Africa than status quo enforcement, which is what de facto the EU has been doing by paying lip service to the democratization and human rights issue. Second set of remarks with respect to the EU approach to region building and peacekeeping in Africa. I think a first set of limitations stem from the fact that region building, especially within the joint EU-Africa strategic partnership, is based on the assumption that the EU is best placed as the equivalent of the EU to promote such an agenda. This is what I would argue is the fallacy of composition. The European Union is based on the pillars that I've discussed earlier on, whereas the African Union is still an intergovernmental organization driven where, of course, not all are equal, but some are more influential than others, especially the 4 countries that provide 75% of the funding of the organization. Libya was one of them. This may explain the difficulties of the AU to position itself initially on what was happening in Libya. But perhaps no Copenhagen criteria. In other words, democratization, human rights, is at best an agenda that one can expect the governments of Africa, as they democratize, when they democratize, would be willing to uphold. Capacity is constrained by membership. Yet, we've been developing these C2C Commission meetings. The EU, of course, the AU, of course, has been keen to adopt a number of institutions that seem to emulate the European ones, so we love it. We here have a case of European soft power. Except that the failure of the EU will probably also discredit the way the European model has been transformed, has been introduced, or at least formally introduced in a context, in a totally distinct context. And the context is totally different because whereas in Europe, when we develop a peace and security policy, it's about external threats, whereas in Africa the APSA is about internal threats. Region building in Africa, we should never forget. Region building in Africa, regionalism, are about state construction and state reconstruction, not about integration. Integration will come as a spillover effect of this first step. So in many ways, the AU and the RECs, the regional economic communities, are very much about the construction of regional orders. Because in many ways, too, Africa's treatment as a single market is taking place increasingly, but not the way we anticipated it. And this is my third point, about the rise of new business transaction templates that also challenge European approaches to interactions between foreign policy, security, and development agendas. Of course, this could be the subject of a specific conference. So I'll just point 2 or 3 key issues. The no strings attached approach, which is in fact the modern transcription of what the Panchila principles were known as, the key principles of the non-aligned movement, a way of resisting encroachment during the Cold War by dominant superpowers. So that principle, very much reasserted through the 1973 and 1975 UN resolutions recently, is contributing to a reassertion of sovereignty, of legal sovereignty, and an empowerment of African states. One of the reasons why so many emerging countries have developed a keen interest for Africa is bloc building. Within an international system that has revived multilateralism, And where the one country, one vote system very much prevailed, well, the Turks decided that in 2008 they would organize a summit with Africa. And they explicitly stated that one of the key reasons was that they wanted to be a candidate to the UN Security Council of 2008-9, and they needed the block of votes from Africa, and they got the vote, and they got elected. But it can be about whaling, it can be about all sorts of things. Whether the African block building matters, and African matters as a result of that. The no strings attached principle also represents a deep challenge to Washington consensus. Not just for the reason you can all think about, the capacity of dictatorships to get away with murder, so to speak. No, for other reasons. Because there is an underlying issue. The underlying issue is basically that our idea, the idea of the Washington consensus, that development stems from the fact that you have first trade liberalization, the capacity to improve your international insertion, and then you democratize, is not the model that has happened in the Flying Geese model type of countries. China is not an example of that. Even India has a democracy, but certainly the flaws of Indian democracy are quite stringent as well. So the basic issue here is that we are discovering that there's a whole range of countries that have managed to develop by being both neo-patrimonial, that is, through the confusion between authoritarian regimes, through the existence of authoritarian regimes, that tend to confuse the office of the ruler with his private interest, where corruption is rife. But these countries have also been developmental. So the Washington model is definitely in deep trouble. And so are a number of our policy orientations. The second point is about the Angola model. That is the nexus between trade, investment, and aid. The fact that we Europeans have tended to think of aid as an instrument of foreign policy. We have struggled for so many decades by trying to make sure that aid would not be an instrument of economic policy. Tied aid should not be acceptable. Well, this is happening. This is happening, and in a big way, because the resources that are put into the oil for infrastructure deals are restructuring the continent in many ways. And they're also creating new roads, they're also creating new railways towards different destinations, because we're also witnessing a change in the routes. Durban has become a very important transshipment center, and this is because it's a transshipment center between Brazil and India and China. So the single approach to Africa is happening, is building up. Not the way we want it, in a way that's much more closer to the Asian models, in a way that doesn't challenge sovereignty, in a way that takes advantage of the role of diasporas, takes advantage of the role of the private sector, takes advantage of a build-up of investments. And it is very striking to see how when you talk to Indian companies or Chinese companies, they right away have a vision of Africa as a single market. We still do not have this vision. So new debates are being introduced, and these new debates challenge our conceptualization of our relations with Africa. To conclude, since time is up, I would like to say that it's high time that we Europeans start realizing that what is at play in Africa is not the marginalization of the continent, but the provincialization of Europe.